Today's daf is Eruvin Daf Daled. Today's dedications today's daf is dedicated by Dina Hirschfeld Becker on her father's second yurtzeit, Alan Hirschfeld, Asher Tuvia ben Shlomo V'chana Zichrono Livracha, and by Michael Radwin in honor of Ariel in celebration of their 20th wedding anniversary, and by Yael and John Cohen in honor of their son Eddie, my nephew, who drafted yesterday. May Hashem protect you as you do the work that enables our country to be free. Aleva Hatzlach. Before we start, a lot of people have been asking, and I've mentioned before, there's a lot of picture books, and I've been trying to figure out how to buy them. A lot are out of print. There's one that was done 35 years ago that I think it's called the Perush Chai. It's out of print as far as I could tell. There's the one, the Ma'or. It's called the Ma'or Mevu'al, which also seemed to be out of print, although some people found that Vishinantam had a booklet of it. You can be a member of Vishinantam and you can order their whole set. They send you booklets for all the Gemaras, and there they have their own pictures, but you have to be a member to buy their book, although it seems someone in the Zoom told me that she actually bought it in a bookstore, but when I called them directly, they didn't seem to say that were the case. But anyway, you should be able to find it possibly in bookstores. The Ma'orot Daf Yomi Gemara, if you can order it, I don't know if you can get it in America, but if you can, in the back of the Gemara, there's lots of pictures from the Ma'or Mevu'ar. It's very good. In Israel, you can call them by phone. You can find it under also Oz V'Hadar puts it out also. You can find it and order it through them. If you need it, I found the phone number. If someone wants, you can ask me. I'll give you the number. But I did find, last night, I found online two different things. Kol Lashon, I mentioned that they were coming out with a book. They were supposed to send it to me. I haven't gotten it yet. It was supposed to be in the printing press last week, but in the print, whatever, being printed. But I did find that on Kol Lashon's website, you can download a PDF version of the whole book. So I recommend going there and trying to download. I tried it this morning. It didn't really work, timed out, but maybe it'll work. Could be my internet wasn't so good. And the portal Daf Yomi has also the Ma'or Mevu'ar all online in PDF form. So it looks to me like those could both be downloaded in both those locations, and therefore I'm going to send you to there if you want to download them and have access. And that you can obviously access anywhere. It should be doable. Okay, so with that, it also seemed to take a long time, the Ma'orot and the portal Daf Yomi. It was taking my computer a very long time to try to access it. But it looks like if you have enough patience and your internet's working well enough, you should be able to download both of them. I assume they're just very heavy files. Okay, with that, we're going to get started. So we ended on Daf Gimel. You can look in the chart. I charted at the end of yesterday's Daf. We're going to have a machloket Abaye and Rava about what Rav Nachman said regarding amot, the size of amot. Are amot the size of, are they made up with 5 handbreadths, which are basically fists, or are they made up of 6 handbreadths? And depended, we had a distinction between sukkah and mavoi versus the amma relating to kilaim, where we're talking about planting seeds within a vineyard. Can you plant seeds of other type seeds in a vineyard? And the question is how much space needed to be left depending on the different types. So depending on which cases, and there were different amounts about how much space needed to be in order to allow it. So when we talk about amot, cubits, do we mean 5 or 6? So Abaye said when it comes to sukkah and mavoi, we mean 5. And when it comes to kilaim, we mean 6, because each case we're going to basically do it more stringently. Place where you need more space, we're going to say it's the bigger. When you need less space, right, to allow something, we're going to be like, let's say 20 amma high is problematic. We're going to make 20 amma high less. We're going to say it's 5 handbreadth cubits instead of 6. We had some questions on Abaye. We answered them. And then we had Rava. Rava said, no, all the amot, let's just read that last line. It's 2 lines from the bottom of Gimel Amud Bet. Rava Mishmei de Rav Nachman Amar, Kol amot ba'ama bat shisha. All cubits are measured by 6. The difference between mavoi and sukkah on the one hand and kilaim on the other hand is going to be halalu sochakot v'halalu atzebot. Those are happy and those are sad. Happy face is relaxed, sad face is tight. So it's going to be a matter of how do you measure the fist? Is the fist, each of the fists, right, will be tight fist versus looser fists. And then you'll have a bit of a difference, and one will be larger, one will be smaller, and it's the same distinction of sukkah and mavoi being the smaller ones, kilaim being the larger ones, but not larger by an entire fist, but larger by just a little bit. And what he says is they shouldn't be exact because, as we said, sometimes they're looser and sometimes they're tighter. So now they're going to say, so now, I skipped. Meitive. So now we're going to say, I just skipped ahead and wrote the wrong line. Sorry, but elo halalu sochakov halalu atzevot. So now the Gemara says meitive. We're going to bring a contradictory source to Abaye. Kol amot she'amru chachamim. This is a braita. Remember, just to remind you, braita is some source that came from the time period of the Mishnah, which preceded the time period of the Gemara, which was basically an external source that the rabbis bring in. It's braita means chutz, outside, meaning it didn't make it into the Mishnah, didn't make it into the Tosefta, which was another book put together in the Tannaitic time period. And they're constantly bringing those things in because they have they're considered stronger than anything an Amora says. So if you question Amora from a Tannaitic source, the Amora has to basically answer up, figure out how he can answer the question against him. So the Gemara, and the word meitive means that we're bringing a contradictory source from the Tannaitic time period against something an Amora said. So now we'll see, the question's going to be on Abaye. Kol amot she'amru chachamim, it says in the Braita, all the cubits that the rabbis talk about, ba'ama bat shisha, it's about a 6 handbreadth cubit. So that sounds very clearly against what Abaye said. Ubilvad shelo yu mechuvanot, as long as they're not precise, meaning sometimes they'll be wider, sometimes they'll be narrower, the handbreadths, but they're 6 always. So bishlam ala Rava, this makes perfect sense. What does it mean? Shelo yu mechuvanot. Ki hechid lahavian halalu sochakov halalu atzevot. Some are looser and some are tighter handbreadths. Ela la Abaye kasha, but for Abaye this is going to be difficult because it says all amot. So what's Abaye going to simply answer? All doesn't mean what you think it means. Amar l'cha Abaye ema amat kilayim ba'amat bat shisha. He means all the amot when it comes to kilayim. Not all the amot when it comes to include sukkah and mavoi. No, all the amot when it relates to kilayim, crossbreeding. So, or cross-planting. So now he says, Bahami, but that can't be. How could Abaye say that? Bahami de katane seifa. Rashbag omer, kol amot she'amru chachamim b'kilayim ba'amat bat shisha u'bavad shelo yu metzumtzamot. In that same source, it's very nice to take things out of context, which we do all the time, right? This goes on all the time in politics especially, right? They take someone's sentence totally out of context and bring it as a problem. But they say you have to look at it in the context. What does it say in the context? Rashbag disagrees with Tanakama. Tanakama said all amot are 6 cubit amot, which now we want to say doesn't really mean all. It means all when it comes to kilayim. Actually, the translation, I was thinking of kilayim, of crossbreeding animals. The real translation is diverse types, right? Diverse planting. So Rashbag omer, kol amot she'amru chachamim b'kilayim ba'amat bat shisha. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel disagrees and says all amot by kilayim are amat bat shisha, which seems to imply what? That when the rabbis said, when Tanakama said, kol amot, they meant everything, and came Rashbag to say, no, kol amot in kilayim specifically is amat bat shisha, and then he adds, bovad shelo yuhu metzumtzamot. But when you measure them, don't measure them tightly, right? What does it mean, metzumtzam here? Metzumtzam means limited. What he means is, again, like we said before, measure them loosely, right? The way Rava said it, they're sochakot, they're wider. So now, again, the Gemara assumes here what I said a minute ago. Michlal de Tanakama kol amot ka'amar. From here you can infer that Tanakama says all amot. So, because Rashbag comes to say only in kilayim is it 6. So now comes Abaye and he has a great answer. He says, Umi Amar L'cha Abaye. Now Abaye doesn't, when it says Amar L'cha, it means Abaye doesn't actually answer. He wasn't questioned directly about this. The Gemara is questioning him later, and we're suggesting that Abaye could answer the following. Amar L'cha, if it says Amar Abaye, it means Abaye said. If it says Amar L'cha, it means someone claims that, Abaye could say this. We're making up an answer for him. The Lav Mi'ika Rashbag Dekai Kapate. Well, you're contradicting what I said from the rabbis, but Rashbag is saying exactly my opinion. Rashbag says all the amot in kilayim are 6 handbreadth amot, which means that's my opinion. So why don't I just say Ana da'amrei ki Rashbag? You can contradict an Amora from a Tannaitic source, but if he has another Tana to hold by, then we can say, well, that's not a contradiction. So in this case, we have someone else he can hold by. He says, oh, I hold like Rashbag. So therefore, Ana, right? So he says, I hold Ana da'amrei ki Rashbag. So then they say, okay, so now let's go back. So Abaye says this, we started with a contradiction against Abaye. We resolved the contradiction by saying, you didn't quote the whole thing, you brought it out of context. Look at the second part, and the second part actually is Abaye's opinion. He holds by Rashba. So Abaye vadai tinahi. Now we're kind of taking perspective. So now looking at this machloket, we see that according to Abaye, this whole issue is every cubit a 6 handbreadth cubit, or is it just by kilaim, diverse kinds? According to Abaye, that is the subject of debate between Tanakama and Rashbag. But l'Rava, mi lema tanaihi, would Rava say it is a machloket Tanaim and I hold like Tanakama? Or does Rava understand the machloket Tanakama and Rashbag in a different way? That's the Gemara's question. So now the Gemara is going to suggest that maybe Rava doesn't think this is a source of Tanaitic debate. Now, what does it do? It strengthens Rava's position if he doesn't think it's a Tanaitic debate. If he thinks it's a Tanaitic debate, then he and Abaye are kind of equal. I mean, it's true that Tanakama goes against Rashbag, and Tanakama is usually the majority, and that would support Rava anyway, but still, it shows more strength to Rava's position if he basically can say, everybody holds like me, and their disagreement is about something else. So now we're going to try to explain that. Amar lecha Rava. Rashbag ha'atal ashmuina. Rashbag is coming to teach us, amat kilaim lo yitzamtzem. There were two parts of what Rashbag said. First, he added the words that it's amat in kilaim, specifically. Then he said, ubavad shelo yuhu mitzumtzamot, as long as they're not exact, which was the opposite of what Tanakama said. Bavad shelo yuhu mechuvanot, that they're not, right, they're not all, well, it's not the opposite. Tanakama said they're not all the same. And Rashbag said when it comes to kilaim, they can't be mitzumtzamot, they can't be tight or exact. So now we say like this. So what is Amar lecha Rava? Rashbag ha'ata lashmuinan, amat kilaim lo yitzamtzem. He wanted to teach you that the amat kilaim should not be litzamtzem. It shouldn't be smaller, right? It shouldn't be the smaller amount. So then, if that's what he wants to say, I want to say like this. Well, then he should have specifically said, right, let's read it again. Tanakama says, all the amot shamru chachamim are amat bat shisha, ubavad shelo yuhu mechuvanot. They're not all going to be the same. To which Rashbag should say, when it comes to amot in kilaim, ubavad shelo yuhu mitzumtzamot. But instead he says, kol amot shamru chachamim b'kilaim. So far that's okay. But then he adds the words ba'amat bat shisha, which sounds like something else is not ba'amat bat shisha. So it's true he adds the words of bavad shelo yuhu mitzumtzamot, but he does also add these words about amat bat shisha. He wouldn't need to add that if he didn't disagree about that. So it must come to exclude something. If it's not coming to exclude sukkah and mavoi, because again, Rava said that Rav Nachman held that in sukkah, in mavoi, any kilaim, it's all amat bat shisha. And we're going to say that he doesn't think it's a machloket tanaim between Tanakama and Rashbag. So how could he explain Rashbag? What's Rashbag talking about when he says specifically this is 6, but other ones aren't 6? Well, something else. Ama Yesod va'ama Sovev. He's talking about the measurements of the Mizbeach. The Mizbeach is the altar that was in the temple. Outside, there were 2 Mizbechot. We'll get to both of them today. One was the Mizbach HaNechoshet, which was the one where they sacrificed all the sacrifices on. It was 32 by 32 amot at its widest point, although on 2 sides it didn't have actually the last amot jutting out, which we'll talk about in a minute. Then there was the Mizbech HaPnimi, the inner one, which stood in the Heichal. This one stood outside the Ulam. Remember, we were talking about the Ulam, the antechamber. This was outside the Ulam, facing Ol Moed, and we're facing the Heichal, or the opening to the antechamber, which then led to the sanctuary. Inside the Heichal, inside the sanctuary, was the Mizbach HaZahav, which is also called the Mizbach HaKtoret. It was the one where they put the incense on. That was a much smaller altar, and we'll get to that soon. So first they're saying it's coming to exclude the Amat Yesod and the Amat Sovev. These were parts of the Mizbeach. If you have a picture, if you have the Ma'or, that's also helpful. If you have the Shanstein, they have a good picture also of this. I'll show it to you on the video so you can see. It's actually like the greatest picture. It's just all the measurements. Okay, you can see it. Now, the way the Mizbeach worked was that the bottom part was at its widest point. The widest, like where the outer Amah was made up on 2 sides of what's called the Yesod, the base. They would pour the blood down all the extra blood after they put the blood on the corners of the mizbeach or on the side of the mizbeach, sometimes on the upper part, sometimes on the lower part. There was this chura sikra, this red line in the middle of the altar. All this we're going to see many, many times over the course of learning Shas. So if you don't get it the first time or the second or the third, you'll get it by the 100th time we mention this. There was a red line that basically demarcated what's upper and what's lower, because sometimes the blood had to be sprinkled on the bottom part or on the upper part. The height of the mizbeach was 10 amot. So now we're going to go starting from the bottom. So at its widest point was 32 by 32. So there was this amah of space that jutted out an amah, and it was the height of an amah. Now the height of that amah, we're going to say, was a 5 handbreadth cubit, whereas all the other amot, other than the ones we're going to say, were 6, but there were a few that were 5. So the 5, and we're going to learn it from a verse in Yechezkel. I don't know what the reason is why they would switch the measurements, but they learned it all out from a verse in Yechezkel. So the first amah of height of the Asode was a 5 handbreadth cubit. Then you go up another 5, so now you're at 6 off the ground, 5 amot off the ground. There's something called the sovev. This is where it goes in. There's like almost like a square on top of the square, where there was a space. It's called the sovev, to go around, and the kohanim would stand over there for certain of the activities they would do. They would stand at that lower point rather than on the top of the altar. This amah also, it jutted out an amah. The fact it juts out an amah of, again, right where it kind of goes in. So that part goes in an amah that's a 5 cubit amah. So the first one we talked about was the height. Now we're talking about going in, not in the height, but in the space going in. Then you go up another 3 and you're at the top of the altar. Even though I said it's 10, the height of the altar was measured by the kranot, the corners of the mizbeach. The corners of the mizbeach jutted out 1 amah above the top of the mizbeach. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. So now we're going to say amat yesod and amat savev, but really it's going to be 4 measurements, not just 2, that are measured by 5 cubit amahs rather than 6, by 5 handbreadth cubits rather than 6. Tichtiv ve'ela midot hamizbeach. This is in Yechezkel Mem Gimel, where he describes the future. The Beit Hamikdash Hashlishi, the third Beit Hamikdash, is going to have, and he describes the measurements of the mizbeach. These are the midot of the mizbeach. Ba'amot amah v'tofach. Now here he says it. The amah is going to be measured as an amah and a tefach. What does that mean? Well, it would have to be an amah is 5, and the tefach is adding 1 more tefach to that, which is 6, meaning the altar is going to be built in general with 6 handbreadth cubits. B'chei ha'amah va'amah rochav ugvulal sfatas saviv zeret ha'achav v'zeh gav ha'mizbeach. Then it switches to talk about amot that aren't amot v'tefach. So what they're going to say is the whole second part of that verse is all saying, but these parts of the mizbeach are going to be only an amah, which means a cubit without the extra tefach, which means 5. So now we're going to darshan what all these things are. So what's chei ka'amah and what's so let's read inside. Chei ka'amah, I think I didn't read the whole verse. V'amar rochav ugvulal sfatas saviv zeret ha'echad. So now they say, v'zeh gav ha'mizbeach. That's the end of the verse. Chei ka'amah ze yesod. Okay, the chei ka'amah is referring to the base. That's the part we said, juts up 1 amah. V'amah rochav ze sovev. It's 1 amah wide. That's the sovev that juts out 1 amah. By the way, when we get to the mizbeach, we'll see they always talk about an amah as a space. If you remember yesterday, we had kilayim. You need 4 amot of space for the animals, the oxen, to go through. For oxen to plow, you need 4 amot of space, but for a person to walk, you need 1 amah. So that's why there's a lot of times where everything juts out an amah on the mizbeach for people to walk. Okay, and all the other inner measurements also, there's things about the kohanim walking around and they need an amah of space. We'll get to all those details much later. But now we're going to say the sovev is 1 amah and it's a 5 handbreadth cubit. Ugvulal sfatas saviv elu hakranot. Around the corners, around is the corners on all the sides. So that's the kranot. Now here we mean both height and the width of each corner of the mizbeach that jutted out. Each of those was an amah that was a 5 handbreadth cubit. And v'zeh gav ha'mizbeach zeh mizbeach hazahav. It was 1 by 1, right, 1 width and 1 length. The mizbeach hazahav, the ketoret. So that amah also is a 1 cubit amah. Okay, the kranot of the mizbeach haketoret. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Ashi Amar Rav. Okay, so that was all. We're now closing that section. So just to review, we had Rava and Abaye who debated whether the Amav, the Sukkah, and the Amav, the Mavoi, were, whether Rav Nachman, right? They were both debating what Rav Nachman said, whether that Amav, the Sukkah, and the Mavoi is different in size from the other type of Amav, or whether whether it's all the same and it's just a matter of wider or tighter hand breadths. Okay, that was the debate between them, and then we brought some sources and tried to work them out. I see someone, before we move on, someone asked about the width of the Asode. So again, the length, and it was an amma wide, okay? It went up an amma, and the up part was a five handbreadth cubit, and the width was 6 handbreadth cubit. And it went along the whole length. It was 32 long. Okay, it went across the whole side on 2 sides, not on all 4 sides. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Ashi Amar Rav. He's now going to make a statement that's going to take us till the middle of the next Amud. Shiurim chatzitzin umechitzin halacha l'Moshe Misinai. Requisite amounts for various things. Chatzitzin, which is if you go into a mikveh, either you put your kli in the mikveh or yourself in the mikveh, and there's something separating between you and the water, that disqualifies the tefillah. And mechitzim, we'll see, but how tall a mechitza is, or laws about boundaries. And this is why it's mentioned here, because mechitza is what's important for our issue. Remember, we said that potentially this koah, this beam, or the lechi that we're building in our eruv serves as a type of wall. So these laws are halacha l'Moshe Misinai. So first we need to understand exactly what shiurim, chatzitzin, and mechitzim are, which I very purposely translated very generally, because that's going to be part of the discussion in the Gemara. What exactly do we mean when we say this? And now we have to explain what halacha l'Moshe Misinai is. It sounds like this was a law passed down to Moshe at Sinai. So there's a few different interpretations of what this means. We've learned many times there's deoraita, things that are by Torah law, and there's Rabbanan, things that are rabbinic in nature. Halacha l'Moshe Misinai is something kind of in the middle. It's something that we say is a very strong tradition. Either it was literally passed down to Moshe, passed down orally, not written. If it was written, it would be deoraita. This is less than deoraita, but it's more than a Rabbanan because it's a very firmly held, established Masoret. Usually there's no machloket about it. And sometimes there's machloket, is it a halacha Moshe Misinai or not? But if everyone establishes it's halacha Moshe Misinai, they usually don't argue about it. Sometimes they argue about the interpretation of it. That's a whole other thing, because they always find something to argue about. But basically these are passed down, either literally passed down to Moshe, or it just means a very old tradition. So the question by each of these is going to be, what do you mean it's passed down to Moshe? Is it this written explicitly in the Torah, or maybe a little less explicitly? So here goes. Each one, it's going to be the same structure. Isn't this Doraita from the Torah? And then they're going to answer, no, not really. Or no, it means something else. So the first one is shiurim. Shiurim de'oraita dichtiv. And now we're going to quote something that we saw both in Masechet Shabbat and we saw in Masechet Brachot. Dichtiv eretz chita u'seora. This is the pasuk that describes Eretz Israel is blessed with 7 fruits. Va'amar Rav Hanan kol pasuk hazeh l'shiurim ne'emar. The reason why they said this was a way to remember all the different requisite amounts. Each of the 7 species is representative of a particular requisite amount. Okay, so let's read inside. So chita, we're going to start in order. Chita, sora, gefen, etc. So what's chita? As it says in the Mishnah, hanichnas labayit hamenuga v'kelav al ktefav v'sandalav v'tabotav biyadav hu v'hem tmeim miyad. If I walk into a house that's leprous, and if I walk into a leprous house, it's kind of like walking into a house where there's a dead body, I become tameh immediately. If I walk in, not only does it make me tameh, it also makes kelim, which could be food, it could be vessels, it could be clothing. So if I walk in and I'm carrying clothing, and they're in my hand, and I'm carrying my shoes, and I'm carrying my jewelry, I become tameh immediately, and the clothes become tameh immediately, because I basically entered into this house, and the clothes have entered into the house, and we become tameh immediately. But haya lavush kelav v'sandalav b'raglav v'tabotav b'etzvotav. This is similar to Shabbat, right? If you're holding something in your hand, you're obligated for carrying those items. I can walk out myself into Rishut HaRabim, but I can't carry things. But if I'm wearing them, it's different than if I'm carrying them, right? Because they're part of my body. I'm not obligated for walking out on Shabbat, right? But there's no Eruv if I'm wearing clothes, right? Thank God. Otherwise, we'd have to walk without clothes on Shabbat, right? So basically, wearing something is considered a different status. So let's say I walk into the house wearing my clothes, and sandalav beraglav, and my shoes are on my feet, v'tabotav be'etzvotav, and my rings are on my fingers. Hu tamei miyad, I become immediately impure. Ve'hein teorin, they don't become impure immediately. There's a certain amount of time, and this we're going to learn from Chita. Ad sheyesheh b'chdei achila pras, pat chitim v'lo pat teorin. It's the amount of time it takes for me to eat a half a loaf of bread. Which type of bread? We all know it's easier to eat. A certain light bread takes less time to eat than a heavier bread. I imagine a sourdough bread, you can't just shove it down your throat. It takes longer to eat. So when we measure how much time it takes to eat a half a loaf of bread, we measure it based on chita bread made from wheat, and not bread made from barley, which was a heavier type of bread. So that's the amount of time. If I stay in the house as long as it takes for me to eat, not that I eat, but if I stay as long as it takes to eat a half a loaf of bread of chitim, and in what kind of manner, there's also different manners people can eat, in a way that I'm reclining. That was a typical way people ate, rather than, let's say, standing up. When I'm eating on the go, I eat quicker, but sitting down, and meaning, and I dip it in something. That was also a typical way they ate, right? These are all from Pesach, right? We lean and we dip. That was the way they typically ate in those days. Get to that in our Pesachim. So chita is to teach us the requisite amount for how long my clothing, if it's on me, is going to be, how long does it take for it to become impure when I go into a house that's a leprous house. Seora, what do we learn from barley? Ditnan etzem kiseora. It says a bone is metame. If a bone, there's a bone from a dead body, it can make someone impure, tamemet. In what way? If it's the size of a barley, which is very small, even that small kind of piece of a bone is metame b'maga u'b'masa ve'ino metame ba'ol. That is not metame in an oel. Okay, we talked about if there's a dead body in the oel, that's if there's flesh. If it's just a bone, it's not metame. But a bone is metame once it's the size of a barley, if you touch it or if you carry it without touching it. So therefore, this would be etzem keseora. Okay, that's what we learned from seora. Gefen kedei revi yayin lenazir. Gefen is how much wine does a nazir drink? Rashi says to get lashes. Who will get lashes if he drinks a revi'id of wine? However, many explain that this doesn't mean as simple as that, because revi'id is always the shiur. You don't need a special thing to tell you that. A revi'id is a quarter of a log. That's the amount. Like kezayit is for food, revi'id is for drinks. So if that were the case, it would say drinks in general. Why does it say specifically lenazir yayin? So they explain that what this is talking about is grapes. A nazir also can't eat grapes. Now, how many grapes? Since the grapes are derived from the wine, the prohibition to drink wine, we measure the grapes in volume and not in the way we normally measure solids, like a kezayit. So how do we do it in volume? Well, we put it inside liquid, and specifically wine and not water. Wine is thicker, so therefore it's going to take more for the wine to displace, and it has to basically displace a revi'id of wine, specifically wine and not water. That's what it's coming to teach us, according to most interpretation. So that's gefen. Te'ena, we're continuing along, we're up to number 4. Ki grogeret lehotza'at Shabbat. We learned this also in Masechet Shabbat, that the amount that you're required for carrying something outside when it comes to food is the amount the size of a fig. That's because it's a little more than our standard. Our standard is always a kezayit, an olive bulb. But when it comes to Shabbat, again, it's melechet machshevet. It has to be something with intent and something important. And food is not so important if it's less than a fig. So therefore, if you carry a food outside from your private domain to your public domain, for example, you're only obligated if it's the size of a fig. If it's smaller than that, you won't be. Rimon, keditnan, kol kle ba'ale batim shiuran kerimonim. This is referring to wooden utensils. It's different for kle cheres, but for earthenware vessels, but a wooden utensil, the assumption is if it's a kle ba'ale bayit, which means it's not a person's work utensils, but it's just a regular person has a bowl in his house. If the bowl gets a hole in it, what do we say? Well, let's say it was already impure. It's now broken and it loses its impurity. Or Can it become impure? If it has such a big hole, then it can't become impure. What's the size of the hole? Well, if I have a hole that it can't even hold a pomegranate, because if it can hold pomegranate still, then it's still useful to me and it's still considered a utensil. That's why you can see it's only balei batim, because a person, if this is their job and they use it for their job, any kind of hole would be a problem, right? It would be much smaller than the hole that would hold a pomegranate. That's a big hole. Eretz zeit shemen. Now we're moving on to the second part of that verse. Zeit, right? Zeitim. Okay, olives. Eretz shekol shiurea kezeitim. It's a land where all the requisite amounts are kazayit. Of course, the Gemara asks, Kol shiurea sakadatach. What do you mean? You can't say all the requisite amounts. We just gave requisite amount for bayit menuga, for coming, or for going in the house is chita. For etzem, it's seora. You can't say all of them are kazayit. So what are they, right? But aren't there all the ones that we just said? It's the majority of the requisite amounts are the size of an olive. Right? That's most food items we measure in a kazayit. Dvash is generally a reference to silan, okay, not honey made from bees, but dvash is dates. Okay, silan is made from dates. We're talking about dates. So, that's a reference to the amount that you need to be obligated. If you eat on Yom Kippur, you will only be obligated not if you eat a kazayit, but if you eat the size of a date, which is a little larger. Now, what's the idea here? The idea here is the Torah never says you can't eat on Yom Kippur. It says you have to initem et nafshotechem, torture your soul. So the assumption is that it's a little bit of a larger amount to refrain from eating that will be considered torturing your soul. Okay, so now they say, this is all, now we have all the shiurim. They all come from the Torah. So how could you say that shiurim are halacha l'Moshe Sinai? So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? What a crazy question. It certainly doesn't say the simple reading of that verse. If you read that verse in the Torah, I'm sure, until you learned the Gemara on this, you never really thought that that's what the verse was referring to. It was referring to the land of Israel is blessed with the following fruits. So, these are halachot, meaning traditions that were passed down from Moshe at Sinai, all these things. They were just connected to the pasuk, and this is often, the rabbis connect things to verses in order to serve as a mnemonic device so that we remember them. So therefore, that's not a problem. Shiurim is what we mean right here, is what we saw, is derived from the verse, but it's not really learned out from the verse. It's just used as a mnemonic, and really it was a tradition passed down to Moshe at Sinai. Chatzitzin. Now we get to the fact that if there's a barrier between you or an object that goes in the mikvah and the water, it's a problem. Your tevilah, your dunking is no good. So also that doraita ninu, it also comes from the Torah. Dichtiv v'rachatz et kol. Actually, the pasuk is quoted wrong. V'rachatz b'mayim et kol b'saro, and you should rinse in water all of your flesh. What did they learn from the juxtaposition of mayim to basal? Shelo yehei davar chotzetz ben b'saro lamayim. There shouldn't be any separation between the flesh and the water. From here you learn chatzitza. That's doraita then. B'mayim, other drashot on this pasuk. B'mei mikvah. Okay, mayim teaches you it has to be mikvah water and not water that you collected or something, right? There's special water that has to be mikvah water. You can't just can't go in a tub. There's all different rules. Kol b'saro, what do we learn from that? Mayim, these are just other halachot. They're just quoting the source, so they're continuing. Mayim shekol gufo levahen. It has to be water that your whole body can fit into at once. It has to be a big enough space that you can fit your whole body in. B'kamahen, how much is that? Ama alama berum shalosh amot. It has to be 1 amma width, 1 amma length, and 3 amot deep. V'shiaru chachamim, and the rabbis assessed the main mikvah arba'im se'ad. The amount of water you can put into that space, the volume it could hold, is 40 se'ad. That's the measurement of a mikvah. In any case, the real part that we wanted for our purposes was rachatz b'mayim et kol b'saro comes to teach you that a chatzitza is midoraita. So what do you mean? Chatzitza is halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So what do they answer? Ki itz rechachata l'saro. The halacha l'Moshe Sinai is teaching you about your hair. Now, what about your hair? We're going to see right now. Rabba bar Rav Huna says, Rabba Rav Huna, what he's saying is the halacha l'Moshe Sinai. What is that? Nima achat kshura chotzetzet, shalosh enan chotzetzot. If you have a knot in one strand of hair, that's going to be a very tight knot, because if you take one strand of hair and you knot it, that will be very tight. that's considered a chatzitza. But shalosh ein chotzitzot. If you have 3 hairs tied together, the assumption is that 3 hairs tied together will be tied together much more loosely than 1 strand knotted. So if 3 strands are together, they're looser, which means the water can actually get everywhere, which means that that's not considered a separation and it's not a problem. Shtayim ein yodea. 2, I don't know. Okay, so 1 I know is a problem. 3 is not a problem. 2 I don't know about. And that must be the halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So now the Gemara says, no, but sa'aro nami de'oraiti. The fact that hair creates a chatzitza in and of itself, that if you would not, a strand of hair, it would be a chatzitza, that's also mentioned in the Torah. Where do we see that? Tanya, or at least derived from the Torah. V'rachatz et kol b'saro. Now the word et is unnecessary. Rachatz et kol b'saro. Why et? Et hatafel l'b'saro. Something that's secondary to the flesh. What would that be? Hair. So we learn the laws of hair from the Torah also. V'zeu se'al. So we're still left with the what's the halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So now they say, well, it's something else. Ki ata hilchata lirubo umiyuto ulemakpid u'she'eno makpid. Okay, for the following criteria of what creates a chatzitza. Uchid Rabbi Yitzchak, I'm going to explain this all right now. Rubo is majority, miyuto is minority. Makpid is you're careful about it, meaning you usually take it off. Eno makpid is you don't usually care about it. It's something you leave on a pretty permanent basis. And according to Rabbi Yitzchak, okay, these are different parameters. We're going to see exactly how this works. Dama Rabbi Yitzchak. Dvar Torah, from the Torah, rubo umakpid alav chotzetz. V'sheino makpid alav eno chotzetz. If it covers the majority of your body, but you're careful about it, meaning you generally take it off. Sorry, if it's both. Covers the majority and you generally take it off, not but, and that's a chatzitza. That's your chatzitza midoraita. It's something that covers most of your body, like clothes. If I go in the mikveh with my clothing on, I generally take my clothing off at some point. So that's going to be considered a chatzitza. Covers, let's say, the clothing is on the majority of my body. That's a chatzitza. V'she'eno makpid alav eno chotzetz. But if I don't care and I never remove it, then let's say I continually leave my clothing on, right? Let's say I never ever take it off. So that wouldn't be a chatzitza if I went in the mikveh with it. But gazru al rubo she'eno makpid mishum rubo makpid. But they said, since rov and makpid is a problem, if it covers the majority and I take it off, so therefore they said, if it's on the majority of my body and I'm not careful about it, I don't generally take it off, but since it covers the majority of my body, that's going to be also a problem, the rabbi said. And additionally, gazru al rubo she'eno makpid mishum rubo makpid. By the way, we learned this all in Nida. Anyone who learned Nida, this is good review. And they also said it's also halacha l'maaseh for people who go to the mikveh and forgot to take something off. So if it's on the majority, they said if it's on the minority of your body, but you usually take it off, okay, like let's say I'm wearing contact lenses, so I take them out every night, but I don't, right there, don't cover the majority of my body, so let's say I went in the mikveh with that. So that's asur miduraban, okay, that's a chatzitza miduraban. So then the Gemara says, why don't we say then, since we're already making all these zero, let's also make it zera if it covers the minority of your body and you don't really care about taking it off. Like, for example, my ring. I never take my ring off. So rings, theoretically, according to this, if you never take your ring off, then it's not a chatzitza, according to this. Okay, so therefore, you can leave it on when you go to the mikveh. Now, generally, we don't do that. People take it off anyway. But the base halacha is that it's totally fine. So first, the Gemara asks, why don't we say that we should make a gzera on that also, on rings, let's say, right? Because it's a minority and it's a no makpid, but maybe if we allow that, people will think majority and not makpid, right? And then we're going to say like this, because of miyuto she'eno makpid, mishum miyuto makpid, because of the minority where you are careful about it, or inami mishum rubo she'eno makpid, maybe people will think if it covers the majority of your body, but you don't ever take it off, maybe they'll think, if I'm going to take my ring off, well, maybe I don't have to take something else off that generally does come off. So even, it never comes off, but it covers the majority of my body. So the Gemara answers, classic answer, Hi gufa gzera v'ana nikor b'dig zor gzera l'gzera. Very fascinating line. If the rabbis institute some sort of gzera, we're not going to make a gzera on the gzera. That's already going too far. The rabbis were protecting the Torah halacha. They weren't protecting their own halachot. So their own halachot, we don't have to make a gzera on that. Okay? There's a big debate here. I'm not going to get into all the details, but just so you should know, Rashi says here, rubo, this whole discussion about rubo and makpid is all about hair, not about the body. So Tosfos jumps on him and says, what are you talking about? This is obviously true also for the body. But some people say, no, what Rashi means is that the hair and the body are considered two separate entities, which is very relevant in the halacha. Because what it means is if you have something covering the majority of your hair, but not the majority of your body, according to one reading in Rashi, that would mean, or really any reading in Rashi, would say that rove of your hair is considered rove, okay? Whereas if we mean here rubo is your body and not your hair, then we mean basically, then if something's covering the majority of your hair, it's not covering the majority of your body, and it wouldn't be a problem, right? If it's rubo ve'eno makpid, let's say it's something you never take off. So there's a big important nafkamina here between how we understand Rashi, but I'm going to just leave that aside, this machloket, and how to understand Rashi. Tosfos understands Rashi, he means just hair, which Tosfos says can't possibly be. And some people try to explain Rashi in other ways to make Rashi make sense. Okay, so that whole thing was to tell us what? That the halacha of chatzitza, that's a halacha l'moshe Sinai, is this issue of rov and makpid and all the details about rubo and makpid and rubo she'eno makpid when we say something is a chatzitza. The very relevant part of this is classic. Somebody goes to the mikveh and they come out and they realize they forgot to take something off. So it depends on what category it falls into, right, what we tell them. Okay, moving on. Now we are up to mechitzot. Okay, and this is the reason why I came up in our sugya, because Eruvin has to do with mechitzot. Mechitzot d'oraita ninu. So that's also d'oraita. Where do we see mechitzas d'oraita? And what we mean is the laws of mechitza. Right now they think that what it means mechitza is how tall a mechitza needs to be for it to be considered a mechitza. This means if I want to make a separation between properties, between, what is considered a separation. It's interesting, chatzitza and mechitza, right? They're similar. They even sound similar. What creates a divider? How tall does my divider need to be considered a mechitza? It's important for walls of a sukkah, for all sorts of things. How tall? 10 tvachim. So they're going to say, mechitzo d'oraita ninu. This is also d'oraita. Da'amar ma, aron tisha v'kaporet tefach. It said that the aron where, right, it was in the Beit HaMikdash or in the Mishkan, was 9 tefachim high, and the kaporet was a tefach above there. Harei kan asara. That's 10 tefachim. That's what we learned dinim of mechitza from the Torah. Okay, according to the Torah, how tall was the aron? Didn't say 9 tefachim. It was 1.5 amot. Now, what's 1.5 amot? 6. Okay, it depends. All depends on how tall your cubits are. Are they 5 tvachim or 6? So if they're 6, then the aron is 6.5, right? It would be 1.5, which would come out to 9. 6 plus 3 is 9. And then the kaporet was another tefach. So that gets you up to 10 tvachim. So there you see. Now, what does this have to do with mechitza? Why do you learn mechitza from the aron and the kaporet? So Rashi explains, based on the Gemara and Sukkah, that Rabbi Yossi says, if you look right where the lines get wide in Rashi, Rabbi Yossi omer le'olam lo yarda shchina lamata me'asara. Dichtiv hashamayim shamayim l'Hashem va'aretz natan libnei adam. The Shechina rested on top of the Aron. And we know that the shamayim is for the heavens, and the earth is for man, and there's no crossover here. So what it means is that the space, and this is where we get that Reshut HaRabim above 10 Tefachim is a Makom Ketur. It's no longer Reshut, no longer connected to the ground. That's no longer the Aretz anymore. This all comes from here, because the Aron was 10 Tefachim high with the Kaporet, and the Shechina would only come above that. That shows it's in a separate Reshut. Now, what does that have to do with Mechitza? Well, if you're going to create a separation, it has to go up to, and this, by the way, goes for Mechitza and Shuls, right? The minimum is 10 Tefachim. Okay? That's the minimum height, 10 handbreadths. Okay? Because for something to be a separation, it has to go to the height of that space. That makes sense. Okay, so there we have it from the Torah. So what does he say? Lo tzricha leRabbi Yehuda da'amar amat binyan ba'ama bat shisha, amat kelim ba'amat bat chamisha. According to Rabbi Yehuda, the building pieces, like the beams and the curtains, all that, the cubits there were 6 handbreadth cubits. But when it comes to the kelim of the Mishkan, like the Aron, they were 5 handbreadth cubits. What does that mean? According to him, the Aron was 7.5, plus the kaporet is 8.5. You don't learn 10 from here, so you don't learn mechitza from here. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, we could say it's halacha l'moshe Sinai. So they say, okay, so fine. So the Rabbi Yehuda, we understand. Well, the Rabbi Meir, Da'amar, Kol Amot Hayu B'Beinoniot, but he thinks they were 6. Ma'ich Lamemar. What can you explain according to him? What's the halacha l'moshe Sinai? The Rabbi Meir, Ki Ata Hilchata Legud Ulelavud Uledofen Akuba. We'll end here today. We'll pick up with the next sugya tomorrow. What does this mean, though? These are three very important concepts. And I'll end this with saying that someone from one of our Hadron groups, Gita Neufeld, Jaroslawitz, I think is the way you pronounce her last name. She wrote up an amazing summary of all sorts of laws. These are part of her summary list. It's going to go up on our site later today. So I mentioned the other day that there's something in Hebrew, a good review of Laws of Eruvin. She did a great summary that I'm going to put up in English. So now we have one in Hebrew, one in English. If you can read both languages, read both, because each one has different things. Anyway, these are three important concepts. Two of them very much relevant for Eruvin. Good means to pull. So good achit and good asik means we can pull a machitza up or down. Meaning, if you have some sort of wall, I'll give you an example. Rishudei Yachid, remember I said it goes up all the way up to the sky? Even though the walls don't go up to the sky, but we view those walls as if pull them up. They go all the way up. That's called good asik. Good achit means pull them down. Like let's say you have sukkah walls that don't reach the ground, but right, we can view them as if they go down to the ground. Okay, that's one thing. Or they don't go all the way up, right? Like your third wall doesn't have to reach the schach. Once it's a certain height, we just view it as if it goes up. The next thing is levud. Levud means if something is less than 3 tvachim away from something else, we can view it as if it's a solid wall. So let's say I put up 10 tvachim high beams, and they're each within 3 tvachim of each other, 3 handbreadths. I can view that as if it's a solid wall. Or if your sukkah walls don't go all the way down to the ground, as long as they're within 3 tvachim of the ground, we view it as if it's on the ground. Okay, those are some applications of levud. Rashi says levud comes from to add something onto something, or to kind of stretch it. Okay, so that's levud, where we view it as if it's stretched. And the last one is dofen akuma, which we talked about yesterday. If your sukkah wall your schach doesn't extend all the way to the wall, or it has problematic schach on the wall, right? If there's schach that's pasul, and your schach is supposed to be attached to your wall, if it's less than 4 amot of schach pasul, we view that as if the dofen is akum, it's slanted, meaning it curves, and you're still at the wall. So when you're kosher schach within that space, right, of within 4 amot, there eventually is kosher schach, we view that as if it actually is attached to your wall, as if your wall kind of curved and hits the schach later. So that's another law, and these 3 laws are halacha l'Moshe Sinai, which makes sense because they're not exactly all logical. You wouldn't necessarily assume them. They were passed down by tradition, and that's what. And someone said, did we learn good achid? And we did learn it in Masechet Shabbat. Comes up there. It comes up in all sorts of places. That resolves all our 3 things that are halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and this actually connects it to us because the other ones didn't really connect to Dinei Eruvin. Okay, we'll stop here for today. We'll pick up tomorrow with the new section. Have a good day.